The war in the Middle East has just entered a new phase. Iran now has a new supreme leader. Oil prices have surged past $114 per barrel. And in just the last 10 days, Israel has reportedly launched over 5,000 strikes. The United States says this may be the most intense period of operations so far. But while missiles dominate the headlines, another crisis could be quietly building inside the global economy. Because in the next few days, the world could see a major inflation report, a critical Federal Reserve interest rate decision, and emergency discussions about global oil reserves. Together, these events could shape financial markets for the rest of 2026. But here's the real question. Are these just isolated crises or early warning signs of something much bigger? History shows that global conflicts rarely start with a single moment. They begin with patterns, and right now, those patterns are becoming harder to ignore. This is 7 warning signals analysts are watching. And you're watching Truth and Triumph, where we break down the world's biggest events so you can stay informed and think critically. Let's begin. One of the most important developments right now is the leadership transition in Iran. Iran's political system is unique. At the very top sits the supreme leader, the most powerful political and religious authority in the country. And leadership changes during a conflict are historically extremely unstable moments. Analysts are now watching the rise of Mojtaba Khamenei, widely seen as a powerful figure within the Iranian political system. Transitions like this are rare, and they often create internal power struggles. Why? Because new leaders must quickly consolidate authority. That usually means demonstrating strength. Sometimes that strength is displayed internally, but other times it's projected externally. Historically, new leaders during wartime often take bolder actions to prove control over the military and political elite, which creates 3 possible outcomes. First, escalation with Israel. Second, expansion of proxy conflicts across the Middle East. And third, internal instability inside Iran's own power structure. Any of those scenarios can increase regional tension. And when regional tensions rise, global markets start to react. Because the Middle East still controls one of the most important assets in the global economy, energy. The second warning signal analysts are watching is the scale of the air campaign now underway. According to US military officials, recent operations have been among the most intense seen in this conflict so far. Reports suggest over 5,000 targets have been struck in roughly 10 days. That level of activity signals something important. This is no longer a limited exchange. It's a large-scale campaign aimed at weakening an entire military network. The targets reveal the strategy. Strikes have reportedly hit missile bases, logistics depots, command centers, and critical oil infrastructure. Each of these targets disrupts a country's ability to fight, but the most significant targets are energy facilities, because once oil infrastructure enters the battlefield, the conflict becomes more than military. It becomes economic warfare. Oil powers transportation, shipping, aviation, and global trade. So even the risk of supply disruption can send markets reacting instantly. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. As strikes expand, oil markets are becoming increasingly volatile, which brings us to the next warning signal the world is watching closely: the sudden surge in global oil prices. Oil prices have now climbed above $114 per barrel, and there are 3 main reasons for that spike. The first is production risk. If Iranian production is disrupted, global supply tightens immediately. The second is shipping risk. Insurance premiums for oil tankers operating near conflict zones can increase dramatically. But the third reason is the most serious: the Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. About 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow waterway. That's roughly 21 million barrels of oil every single day. If anything disrupts that flow, global energy markets panic. And recent reports indicate The US naval forces have been targeting vessels capable of laying naval mines. Why would that matter? Because naval mines are one of the simplest ways to block shipping lanes, which suggests that military planners are already preparing for a worst-case scenario, a potential blockade attempt, and if that happens, oil prices could move far beyond $114. Now, let's talk about a scenario financial markets are quietly preparing for. What happens if the Strait of Hormuz becomes partially blocked? This narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean is one of the most critical energy choke points on Earth. About 20% of the world's oil supply moves through this corridor every single day. That's roughly 21 million barrels of oil passing through a channel only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. So even a temporary disruption could shake the global economy. Energy analysts warn that in a serious disruption, oil prices could surge to $150 to $180 per barrel. And once oil jumps that high, the ripple effects spread quickly. Gasoline prices surge, airline tickets become more expensive as jet fuel costs explode, food prices rise as transportation becomes more costly, and global shipping slows as companies struggle with higher fuel expenses. Economists call this a logistics shock, because when energy routes become unstable, the entire global economy feels the impact. War in 2026 doesn't just affect battlefields, it affects supply chains. Airspace closures across parts of the Middle East are forcing airlines to reroute flights. Longer routes mean higher fuel costs. Some carriers are already canceling flights entirely. Meanwhile, shipping companies are reconsidering routes through sensitive waterways. That affects global trade in ways most consumers never see directly. Electronic shipments can be delayed, pharmaceutical supply chains can tighten, auto manufacturers may struggle to receive key components, and when supply chains slow down, prices tend to rise. Which brings us to a very important issue. The US economy is entering this geopolitical moment with several existing pressures already in place. Right now, the American economy is facing four powerful forces at the same time. The first is war-driven inflation. Energy shocks have historically pushed prices higher, making inflation harder to control. The second force is uncertainty around the Federal Reserve. The Fed is led by Chairman Jerome Powell, but policy debates and speculation about figures like Kevin Walsh influencing future strategy are creating uncertainty, and markets hate uncertainty. If oil prices continue rising, the Fed may be forced to keep interest rates higher for longer. The third force is fiscal policy. Massive spending programs from defense budgets to infrastructure and industrial policy continue injecting money into the economy. When you combine government spending, war spending, tariffs, and energy shocks, inflation pressure can build quickly. And the fourth force is political instability in Washington. Budget fights occasionally raise the risk of partial government shutdowns. Individually, these problems are manageable, but together, they create what economists call a perfect storm. Right now, global markets are on edge. Investors, economists, and governments are watching three critical signals that could shape the global economy in the coming months. The first is the CPI inflation report. This report measures how fast consumer prices are rising, things like food, transportation, and housing. And one factor driving inflation right now is energy prices. When oil costs rise, transportation and manufacturing become more expensive, and those costs eventually reach consumers. The second signal is the next interest rate decision by the Federal Reserve. Led by Chairman Jerome Powell, the Fed must decide whether inflation still requires higher interest rates or if the economy is cooling enough to consider rate cuts. That decision will send a powerful signal to investors worldwide. And the third signal is the flash PMI report. PMI tracks business activity in manufacturing and services. If rising energy costs begin slowing production, it could be an early warning sign of recession risk. Together, these signals may determine whether geopolitical tensions remain contained or begin spilling into the global economy. Another factor analysts are watching is the reaction of other major powers. China has taken a cautious diplomatic stance so far. China relies heavily on Middle Eastern energy imports, so stability in the region is economically critical. Russia has historically aligned strategically with Iran in certain geopolitical contexts. However, Russia is also managing its own geopolitical conflicts and economic pressures. European nations are primarily focused on energy security and avoiding supply disruptions for now. Most global powers appear focused on preventing escalation rather than expanding the conflict. That's an important distinction because a true world war requires multiple great powers entering the conflict directly, and right now, most governments appear determined to avoid exactly that scenario. For most people watching this, global geopolitics can feel distant, but the economic effects show up in everyday life. You may notice gas prices creeping higher, airline tickets becoming more expensive, groceries slowly rising, electronics taking longer to ship, car repairs costing more. Modern economic crises rarely arrive as sudden collapses. They arrive as slow increases in everyday costs. So, what can ordinary people do? First, build emergency savings. Geopolitical shocks often create temporary economic disruptions. Second, reduce high interest debt. Rising interest rates make debt more expensive. Third, think long term with investments. Historically, markets eventually recover from geopolitical shocks. And finally, stay informed, because understanding global events helps you make smarter financial decisions. Interestingly, every crisis also creates economic winners. Three industries that historically benefit during geopolitical tension include energy companies. Higher oil prices increase revenue for producers. Defense companies. Military spending tends to rise during periods of conflict. And domestic manufacturing. Governments often accelerate efforts to bring supply chains back home during unstable global periods. Understanding these trends can help investors think strategically about the future. The headlines may focus on missiles and diplomacy, but the deeper story unfolding right now is the economic chain reaction beneath the conflict. Energy markets, central banks, supply chains, government spending. When all of these forces begin shifting at the same time, the global economy doesn't just slow down, it enters a new phase. History shows this again and again. Moments of geopolitical tension often become turning points for markets and global power. Most people react only after the change becomes obvious, but a small group of investors and decision makers are already watching the signals. Inflation data, interest rate decisions, our business activity, because those signals reveal where the world is heading next. In times like this, information isn't just interesting, it's an advantage, and the people who understand these shifts early are usually the ones best prepared for what comes next, because the real story isn't just in the headlines, it's in the patterns behind them. This is Truth and Triumph, where knowledge becomes an advantage.